The first thing I noticed wasn't the broken fence, it was how still they were. 43 head of Charlie's Herefords standing in my north paddock like they'd been carved from red stone, every last one facing east toward the scrubland. Not a tail flick among them. Not even when I slammed the ute door hard enough to echo across the empty paddock. I'd been checking the boundary fence every morning for 3 weeks now, ever since the feed started getting scarce. The routine had become automatic: drive the perimeter at sunrise, look for breaks, count heads, pray for rain that never came. Drought does things to cattle, makes them desperate enough to push through wire that would have held them easy in a good season. But this wasn't desperation, this was something else entirely. The fence line told the story clear enough. 3 posts snapped clean through, the aged timber split along the grain like someone had taken an axe to seasoned hardwood. Wire strands hanging loose like broken guitar strings, still humming faintly in the morning breeze. Should have been cattle spread across 2 paddocks by now, heads down in whatever dry grass they could find. Instead they stood there in formation, 43 pairs of eyes fixed on nothing I could see. I walked slow through the mob, talking low the way Dad taught me 30 years back. My boots crunched on grass stems brittle as matchsticks, each step raising small puffs of dust that caught the early light. Easy now, girls, easy, but none of them even flicked an ear my direction. Up close I could see the whites of their eyes, that rim of panic that meant trouble brewing. Their flanks were slick with sweat despite the cool morning air, and when I got within arm's reach of the lead cow, a big brindled thing I'd seen Charlie show off at the pub, she was trembling like a leaf. Her udder was tight with milk she hadn't let down, her breathing shallow and rapid. But still staring east, I followed their gaze across the fence line, across my own empty paddock to where the scrubland started. Miles of mallee and saltbush stretching toward the sunrise, same as it had been since grandfather cleared this place in 1953. Same red dirt baked hard as concrete, same scattered rocks weathered smooth by decades of wind and rain. Same nothing that had always been there, yet every cow was locked onto it like it held the secrets of the universe. The sensible thing would have been to drive the mob back through the gap and worry about the fence later. But 30 years of working cattle had taught me to pay attention when they spooked like this. Cattle see things different than people do. Feel things different too. I was still puzzling it over, wiping sweat from my forehead with a sleeve already damp from the morning humidity, when Charlie's old blue Falcon came rattling down the access track. Dust plume trailing behind it like a banner, the engine coughing and missing on at least one cylinder. Charles Morrison, Charlie to everyone who'd known him longer than 5 minutes, had been my neighbor since before I was born. 78 years old and still running 2,000 acres with nothing but stubbornness and spite to keep him going. The Falcon wheezed to a stop beside my ute, radiator steam hissing from under the bonnet. Charlie climbed out slow, favoring his left hip with the careful movements of a man who'd broken too many bones over too many years. He looked older than I'd seen him in years, his face grey as old leather and his hands shaking as he pulled his akubra down against the morning sun. The hat brim cast deep shadows across features that seemed to have aged overnight. "Morning, Tom." His voice came out cracked, like he hadn't used it in days. When he swallowed, I could see the effort it took. "Charlie." I nodded toward his cattle, noting how he wouldn't quite look at him directly. "Got some visitors." He looked at the mob for a long moment, and I saw something flicker across his face. Fear, maybe. Or recognition. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed again. "They been like that long?" "Found 'em 20 minutes ago." I checked my watch, 7:15 a.m., the sun already climbing toward what promised to be another scorching day. "Haven't moved since." Charlie walked among his cattle like a man checking the dead after a battle. His boots scraped against the hard packed earth, each step deliberate and careful. He knew every animal by sight, knew their bloodlines going back 3 generations, their temperaments, their habits. I watched him take in their stillness, their fixed attention, the way they barely seemed to breathe. His weathered hands reached out to touch familiar flanks, and I saw the cattle flinch away from contact that would normally comfort them. "Something's got 'em spooked," I said, my own voice sounding strange in the unnatural quiet. "Yeah." The word came out flat, final. He pulled his hand back from a young heifer who'd always been his pet, his fingers trembling. "Something has." We stood there in the growing heat, 2 men who'd worked the land long enough to know when things weren't right. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant cry of a crow and the soft whisper of wind through grass so dry it crackled underfoot. The Morrison place had been in Charlie's family since the 1920s, carved out of scrubland by his father and grandfather with nothing but determination and back-breaking work. Charlie himself had taken over in 1967 when his old man had a heart attack during shearing, dropping dead between the wool press and the sorting table. Been holding on ever since, through droughts and floods, through cattle prices that rose and fell like a fever dream, through all the changes that had driven smaller operations under. But the last few years had been harder than most. The drought that started in 2019 had never really broken, just eased off enough to give false hope before tightening its grip again. Feed prices had gone through the roof. Cattle prices had dropped, like stones in a deep well. I'd watched neighbors sell up one by one, watched the bank take properties that had been family holdings for generations. The Hendersons to the south had lasted until last spring, their "for sale" sign now bleached white by the sun. The Patels who'd bought the old Williams place had given up after 2 seasons, taking jobs in town rather than watch their savings disappear into red dirt. My own place wasn't much better off. 3 generations of McKinnons had worked this land, and I was starting to wonder if I'd be the last. The books didn't lie. Red ink had been winning over black for 3 seasons running. Every morning I woke up wondering if this would be the day I'd have to make the call I'd been dreading, the one to the stock agent about clearing the place out. The one that would end a century of McKinnon ownership and turn me into just another casualty of climate and economics. But Charlie's troubles ran deeper than drought and debt. Over the past months I'd noticed changes in him. He'd always been a talker, the kind of man who'd bend your ear at the pub about politics or cattle prices or whatever else was grinding his gears. Lately though, he'd gone quiet, kept to himself. The few times I'd seen him in town he'd looked distracted, jumpy, like a man expecting bad news. His shoulders had developed a permanent hunch, and he'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. "You been having any other problems?" I asked, still watching his cattle. Their ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds I couldn't hear. "Anything that might spook 'em like this?" Charlie took off his hat and ran a gnarled hand through what was left of his hair. In the harsh morning light he looked every one of his 78 years, maybe a few more besides. Liver spots dotted his scalp, and his neck had the loose skin of a man who'd lost too much weight too quickly. "Problems," he repeated, like the word tasted bitter on his tongue. His eyes fixed on something in the middle distance, something I couldn't see. "Yeah, Tom, you could say I've been having problems." He walked back to his falcon without explaining, stood there with his hands on the roof like he was trying to decide something. The metal was already hot enough to burn, but he didn't seem to notice. The silence stretched out between us, broken only by the distant cry of a crow and the soft whisper of wind through dry grass. I watched sweat bead on his forehead and run down into the deep lines bracketing his mouth. "I'll get him back through the fence," he said finally, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "Fix up the brake too. No hurry on my account." I gestured toward my empty paddock, where the grass was so sparse you could count individual stems. "Plenty of room here. Might even be doing me a favor, keeping the grass down." That got me a sharp look. Charlie's pale blue eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. He knew as well as anyone that there wasn't enough grass in either paddock to keep a goat alive, let alone 43 head of cattle. We were both just dancing around the truth of it, that neither of us could afford proper feed, that we were both hanging on by our fingernails, waiting for rain that might not come. Waiting for miracles we stopped believing in. "All the same," he said, his voice gaining strength, "they don't belong here." He climbed back into the Falcon and started the engine, but instead of driving away he sat there for a long moment. The engine idled rough, knocking and pinging like it was running on watered fuel. Steam continued to rise from under the bonnet, and I could smell the sweet scent of antifreeze mixing with engine oil. Charlie stared out through the windscreen toward the eastern scrubland, his lips moving like he was talking to himself, or maybe arguing with someone only he could see. Finally he looked at me through the open window. His face was pale beneath the weathered tan, and his hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make his knuckles white. "Tom, you keep your stock away from the eastern boundary for a while. The section that runs up against Honeysuckle Creek." "Why?" I walked closer to his window, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands trembled against the wheel. "What's out there?" But Charlie was already driving away, the Falcon's engine coughing and protesting as he turned it around. I watched him disappear down the track, leaving nothing but dust and questions hanging in the still air. The acrid smell of his exhaust lingered long after the sound of his engine faded. His cattle were still standing like statues, still staring east. Whatever had spooked them wasn't letting go. I could see it in the tension of their muscles, the way they held their heads high and alert. Every few seconds one would snort or stamp, but none broke formation. None looked away from whatever invisible threat held their attention. I looked toward the scrubland myself, trying to see what they saw. Squinting against the climbing sun, I scanned the horizon for anything unusual. But there was nothing there except the same empty country that had been there yesterday and the day before and all the days stretching back to when my grandfather first laid eyes on this place. Nothing but red dirt and stunted vegetation and the growing certainty that something had changed, even if I couldn't put my finger on what. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint scent of something chemical, something that didn't belong in the clean air of cattle country. I breathed deeper, trying to identify it, but the smell was gone as quickly as it had come. Probably just imagining things, letting Charlie's nervousness infect my own peace of mind. But as I walked back to my ute, I found myself glancing over my shoulder toward the east, toward whatever had Charlie Morrison running scared and his cattle standing sentinel against the morning light. The smell hit me before I saw anything else, diesel fuel and something chemical that made my nose burn and my eyes water. I pulled up short at the edge of Charlie's property, the familiar smell of his homestead, leather and hay and the honest sweat of working animals, overpowered by something harsh and industrial. Charlie's homestead sat in a shallow depression between two low ridges, the old weatherboard house dwarfed by a massive shed that had seen better decades. The iron roof was rusty and patched with flattened drums, and the walls showed the weathered grey of timber that hadn't seen paint in 20 years. But it was the ute parked beside his front steps that caught my attention, everything about it wrong for a man who usually planned ahead with military precision. The tray was loaded with supplies, and not the kind you'd expect to see on a cattle station. Plastic containers of water, enough for a man to last a week or more in rough country. Enough tinned food for a month, beans and stew and sardines stacked in neat rows like a military deployment. A sleeping bag and tarp, both showing wear from recent use. And strangest of all, what looked like a portable radio antenna jury-rigged to some kind of battery pack, the kind of setup you'd use for emergency communications in areas without mobile coverage. Charlie was bent over the tray, securing everything with rope, his movements quick and nervous. His hands shook as he worked, and I could see sweat stains spreading across his shirt despite the cool morning air. Every few seconds he'd pause and look toward the eastern horizon, like he was expecting something to appear there. "Going somewhere?" I called out as I climbed down from my own vehicle. Charlie straightened so quickly I thought he might put his back out. For a moment he looked at me like he couldn't quite place who I was, his eyes wide and unfocused. Then recognition flickered in his pale blue eyes along with something that might have been relief. His shoulders sagged, and he let out a breath I didn't realize he'd been holding. "Tom." He wiped his hands on his jeans, leaving dark stains that smelled of machine oil and something else, something that made my throat tighten. "Didn't hear you coming. Hard to sneak up on anyone in this country." I nodded toward his supplies, noting how he'd positioned himself between me and the ute tray, like he was trying to hide what he'd loaded there. "Looks like you're planning an expedition." "Just getting ready." His hands wouldn't stay still, fidgeting with the rope, adjusting containers that didn't need adjusting. The knots he'd tied were sloppy, unlike the precise work I'd seen him do 1,000 times before. Never know when you might need to get away for a while. I'd known Charlie Morrison for 15 years, ever since Dad passed and left me the station. He'd been the one to help me through those first brutal months when I'd barely known a bull from a steer, when the isolation and responsibility had nearly broken me. He'd never been what you'd call talkative, but he'd always been steady, reliable, the kind of man who thought before he spoke and meant every word he said. The man standing in front of me now looked like he'd blow away in the next strong wind, his weathered features drawn tight with exhaustion and fear. "Charlie, what's this about?" I stepped closer, close enough to see the burst capillaries in his eyes, the way his lips were cracked and dry like he'd forgotten to drink water. "First your cattle break through onto my place, acting like they've seen ghosts. Now you're packing up like you're heading for the hills." He stopped fiddling with the rope and looked at me directly for the first time since I'd arrived. His eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by deep lines that seemed to have appeared overnight. When he blinked, it was slow and deliberate, like his eyelids weighed too much. "You ever see things, Tom?" The question came out in a whisper, barely audible above the sound of wind through the ironbarks. "Things that shouldn't be there?" The question caught me off guard. I studied his face, looking for signs of confusion or illness, but his gaze was sharp and focused despite the exhaustion. "What kind of things?" "Lights." He turned toward the east, toward the boundary he'd warned me to avoid, his hand shading his eyes against the climbing sun. "Moving across the scrubland where there's no road, no reason for anyone to be." His voice gained strength as he continued, like speaking the words aloud made them more real. "Started seeing 'em again 3 nights ago. Same time the cattle went mad." I followed his gaze but saw nothing except the familiar landscape of sparse vegetation and weathered stone. Heat shimmer was already beginning to rise from the red earth, distorting the horizon like water. Could be someone camping. Tourists, maybe. Charlie made a sound that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so bitter. The sound scraped out of his throat like broken glass. "Tourists. Yeah, that's what I told myself 30 years ago." He looked at me with those bloodshot eyes, and I saw something in him that made my blood run cold. "Tourists don't take people, Tom." "Take people?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. A crow called from somewhere in the ironbarks, and in the distance I could hear the low of cattle, the everyday sounds of a working station. But Charlie's homestead felt different now, charged with tension and unspoken dread. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. My brother Danny. The name came out like a prayer, or maybe a confession. You never met him. This was before your time, before your father even bought this place. Danny was younger than me by 8 years, but he knew cattle better than anyone. Had a feel for the land, you know? Could read weather patterns like other people read newspapers. Charlie walked over to the old tree stump he used as a chopping block and sat down heavily. The wood was scarred from decades of use, stained dark with sap and age. I could see the exhaustion in every line of his body, the way his shoulders curved inward like he was protecting himself from a blow. Summer of '93. Drought worse than this one, if you can believe it. He picked up a wood chip and turned it over in his fingers, his movements automatic and unconscious. We were running cattle on every scrap of feed we could find, pushing them further and further into the scrubland. Danny took a mob out to the eastern boundary, place where Honeysuckle Creek runs dry most years. I knew the spot. Marginal country even in good times, nothing but tough grass and stubborn shrubs that somehow managed to survive on almost no water. The kind of place you only grazed cattle when everywhere else had been eaten down to bare earth. Danny came back that first night talking about lights moving through the scrub. Charlie's voice was distant now, lost in memory. Said they weren't like anything he'd seen, too bright to be campfires, moving too steady to be spotlights. I told him it was probably the mining survey crew. There'd been talk of mineral exploration in the area. Charlie picked up a handful of red dirt and let it run through his fingers, watching the dust disperse in the slight breeze. His hands were stained with something dark, and I caught that chemical smell again, stronger now. Second night, same thing. But this time Danny found something else. His voice dropped even lower, and I had to lean forward to hear him. A section of ground where nothing would grow anymore. Maybe 50 meters across, perfectly round. The earth looked wrong. Sick. And there was a dead roo lying right in the center of it, no marks on it, no obvious cause. The skin on the back of my neck prickled. I thought about my own cattle, the way they'd been staring east with that fixed intensity. What did you do? What do you think? I told him to stay away from it. Charlie's hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white with tension. But Danny was curious about everything. Couldn't leave a mystery alone. Said someone needed to find out what was happening out there. A wedgie circled overhead, its cry sharp and lonely in the still air. Charlie watched it for a moment, his eyes tracking its lazy spirals against the blue sky. When he continued, his voice was flat and emotionless, like he was reciting facts from a report. Third night, Danny didn't come home. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with 30 years of guilt and grief. I found his horse the next morning, wandering loose near the eastern boundary. Saddle was still on, reins dragging. But no sign of Danny. Did you call the police? Course I did. Charlie stood up abruptly, the movement sharp and angry. They searched for 3 days. Brought in helicopters, dogs, the works. Sergeant Williams came out from town, treated it like a missing person case. Professional, thorough, never found so much as a bootprint. He walked back to his ute, checking the ropes again with shaking hands. The movement was compulsive, like he couldn't stop himself from making sure everything was secure. It was like he just vanished. And the lights? The lights stopped appearing after that. Charlie's voice was bitter now, edged with self-recrimination. Thought it was over. Told myself Danny had probably fallen down a mine shaft or got snake bit or any of a dozen other things that can kill a man out here. But then the rains came, and everything went back to normal for a while. He paused, his hands stilling on the rope. When he looked at me again, his eyes were haunted. Until now, I repeated the words, tasting their weight. The morning sun was climbing higher, and I could feel sweat beginning to bead on my forehead. They always come back during drought years, Tom. When the land gets desperate, when people get desperate. And they always take someone. I wanted to tell him he was imagining things, that 30 years of guilt and isolation had finally gotten to him. But I remembered the way his cattle had been standing that morning, all facing the same direction like they were watching something I couldn't see. I thought about the chemical smell hanging in the air, the wrongness that seemed to permeate Charlie's homestead. Charlie, if you really believe this, we should call the police. Get him to investigate. And tell him what? He laughed, but there was no humor in it, just the harsh sound of a man who'd run out of options. That mysterious lights killed my brother 3 decades ago. They'll lock me up or put me in a home. Either way, won't do Danny any good. He climbed into the ute and started the engine. The motor turned over rough, coughing and missing like it hadn't been serviced in months. Through the open window, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part determination, part terror, part resignation. I'm going to find out what happened to Danny. What's still happening? His knuckles were white where he gripped the steering wheel. But first, I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. He put the vehicle in gear, and I heard the transmission grind in protest. Keep your cattle away from the eastern boundary, Tom. And if you see lights moving in the scrubland at night, don't go investigating. Just pack up and leave. Where are you going? But Charlie was already driving away, the ute lurching as he worked the clutch with unsteady feet. I watched him disappear down the track, leaving me standing in his empty yard with more questions than answers and the growing certainty that something was very wrong in the country I'd called home all my life. The chemical smell lingered in the still air, mixing with the familiar sense of dust and drought-stressed vegetation. I walked to where Charlie had been loading his supplies, and there on the ground I found something that made my skin crawl, a small puddle of liquid that gleamed with an oily rainbow sheen, like fuel mixed with something else. Something that didn't belong on a cattle station. I drove home with Charlie's warning echoing in my head, but the practical demands of station life didn't pause for mysteries. The cattle still needed checking, the water troughs were running low, and I had a dozen other tasks that couldn't wait. Yet as the afternoon wore on, I found myself glancing repeatedly toward the eastern boundary, half expecting to see something unusual. By 5 o'clock, the sun was sitting heavy and orange on the horizon, painting the drought-stricken landscape in shades of rust and gold. Long shadows stretched across the paddocks, and the air had that thick, oppressive quality that promised another scorching day tomorrow. I headed out to bring the cattle in for the night, a routine I'd followed thousands of times before. My boots crunched on grass so dry it sounded like walking on cornflakes, and dust rose with every step. The mob was scattered across the southern paddock, heads down, searching for any remaining patches of edible grass. But as I approached on foot, something felt wrong. The cattle were restless, shifting and lowing in a way I hadn't seen before. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like something was driving them beyond normal hunger or thirst. Old Bertha, my lead cow who usually came at the first whistle, stood at the edge of the group with her head raised high, nostrils flaring. Her udder was tight and swollen, milk that should have been let down hours ago still trapped inside. She was facing east. "Come on, girls," I called, slapping my leg in the familiar gesture that had worked for 15 years. A few of the younger cattle looked my way, their eyes rolling white with anxiety. But none moved toward the yards. Instead, they seemed to press closer together, their collective anxiety palpable in the still air. I could hear their breathing, rapid and shallow, and smell the sharp scent of fear sweat from their hides. I walked further into the paddock, raising my voice. "Hey, come on." The words echoed off the low hills, but the cattle remained motionless. These were animals that had been yard-trained since they were calves, animals that knew the evening routine better than I did. Yet they stood there like they were rooted to the spot, their attention fixed on something beyond the fence line. That's when I noticed the glow. At first, I thought it was just the last rays of sunlight catching on the rocky outcrops to the east. The sun was low enough to create strange reflections, and the heat shimmer could play tricks with your eyes. But as I watched, shading my eyes with one hand, the light seemed to pulse gently, too steady and too focused to be natural. It was coming from somewhere in the scrubland, maybe a kilometer away, right about where Charlie's eastern boundary met the Crown land. The light had an artificial quality, too white and too bright for sunset or campfire. A cold certainty settled in my stomach, heavy as a stone. I pulled out my phone to call Charlie, but the screen showed no signal bars. There never was coverage this far from town, nothing but empty space where the network couldn't reach. The cattle were getting more agitated by the minute. One of the younger bulls let out a low bellow and actually backed away when I approached, his eyes showing white around the edges. These animals had never shown fear of me before, but now they acted like I was something dangerous, something to be avoided. When I reached toward Bertha's familiar flank, she flinched away from my touch like I'd burned her. I gave up on the yards and decided to check on them again later. Maybe whatever was spooking them would pass, and they'd settle down after dark. I walked back to the homestead as the sun finally disappeared, but the strange glow on the eastern horizon remained, if anything growing slightly brighter as the natural light faded. It cast no shadows and lit no surrounding landscape, just that unnatural white gleam hanging above the scrubland like a malignant star. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept thinking about Charlie's story, about his brother Danny and the lights that appeared during drought years. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those cattle standing motionless in formation, their attention fixed on something I couldn't see. Around midnight, I got up and looked out the bedroom window, pressing my face to the glass. The glow was still there, steady and unnatural against the star-filled sky. If I squinted, I thought I could see it pulsing slightly, like a heartbeat made of light. I was up before dawn, and my first thought was to check on the cattle. My boots hit the wooden steps with hollow thuds as I hurried down from the veranda, and the morning air was cool against my face. What I found made my blood run cold. The mob had moved as far west as they could get within the paddock boundaries, pressed up against the fence like they were trying to escape something. Several were bleeding from minor cuts where they'd pushed through the barbed wire, their hides scraped and torn. They looked exhausted, as if they'd spent the entire night in a state of panic, their eyes sunken and their flanks hollow with dehydration. And one was missing. I counted twice to be sure, walking among the agitated cattle and checking every face I knew. The little black calf I'd noticed yesterday, the one that had been grazing nearest to the eastern fence, was nowhere to be seen. She was distinctive, the only solid black in a mob of reds and roans, with a white star on her forehead that made her easy to spot. I walked the fence line, looking for breaks where she might have gotten through, and found what I was looking for about halfway along the eastern boundary. The wire had been pushed down, posts knocked askew like something had hit them with tremendous force. There were clear hoof prints leading into the scrubland, pressed deep into soil that had been baked hard by weeks of drought. The tracks showed panic, long strides and scattered earth where the calf had been running hard. I went back to the house for my rifle and the emergency kit I always carried when heading into rough country. The .303 felt heavy in my hands as I checked the action and loaded the magazine, the familiar weight both comforting and ominous. The smart thing would have been to wait until later in the day, maybe bring help. But that calf was valuable breeding stock, and besides, Charlie's warnings had left me with questions that needed answering. The trail was easy to follow at first. The ground was hard packed from the drought, but there was enough dust and loose soil to show the calf's passage clearly. She'd headed almost due east, moving fast from the look of the stride length. The prints were deep and widely spaced, showing an animal in full flight. But after about half a kilometer, something changed. The tracks became erratic, wandering in small circles before straightening out again. Then they stopped altogether, as if the animal had simply vanished into thin air. I was standing at the edge of what looked like a natural clearing in the scrubland, maybe 30 meters across. But something was wrong with it. The mallee scrub that covered every other inch of this country simply didn't exist here. The boundary was sharp and unnatural, like someone had drawn a perfect circle with a compass and erased everything inside it. Nothing grew in this space. Not a blade of grass, not a single hardy saltbush plant that should have been able to survive anything. It was as if the earth itself had been poisoned, turned into something hostile to life. The calf lay in the center of the clearing. I approached carefully, rifle ready, scanning the surrounding scrub for any sign of predators. But there were no tracks around the dead animal, no obvious signs of attack. The earth around her was strange, not the familiar red-brown soil I knew, but something grayer, almost metallic in appearance. The little black calf simply lay on her side as if she'd laid down to sleep and never woken up. I knelt beside her, the rifle across my knees, looking for wounds, bite marks, anything that might explain what had happened. Her eyes were open but clouded, the bright intelligence gone out of them. When I touched her flank, the skin felt wrong, too cold, too stiff. She'd been dead for hours, maybe since the time I'd first noticed the lights. But there wasn't a mark on her. No blood, no torn flesh, nothing to indicate violence of any kind. Her coat was still glossy black, unmarked by tooth or claw. She could have been a perfect specimen except for the fact that she was dead. I stood up and really looked at the clearing for the first time. The strange soil wasn't just grey, it had an odd, oily quality that seemed to reflect the morning light in rainbow patterns, like fuel spilled on wet pavement. The surface was too smooth, too uniform, lacking the random texture of natural earth. And there were marks in the ground, geometric patterns that definitely weren't natural. Straight lines, perfect circles, shapes that spoke of machinery and human activity. The patterns were too precise, too purposeful to be anything but artificial. This wasn't some mysterious supernatural phenomenon. Someone had been here, someone was still coming here, doing something that killed the vegetation and poisoned the ground. Something that had killed my calf and, I was beginning to suspect, had killed other things as well. I pulled out my phone, hoping for a signal, but found nothing but empty bars. The smart thing was to get back to the house and call this in to the police. But as I turned to leave, I heard the sound of a vehicle approaching fast through the scrub. The engine noise was wrong, too loud, too rough, like someone driving without regard for the terrain. Charlie's battered ute burst into view, the old man behind the wheel looking more panicked than I'd ever seen him. He pulled up at the edge of the clearing with a spray of gravel and dust, and I could see his knuckles white where he gripped the steering wheel. His face was pale and drawn, sweat staining his shirt despite the cool morning air. "Tom, Jesus, you shouldn't be here." His voice cracked as he climbed out, his movements unsteady. His eyes went to the dead calf, then to the poisoned ground around us, and I saw recognition flicker across his weathered features. "How long have you been here?" "Just got here." I gestured at the unnatural clearing, at the geometric patterns carved into the earth. "Charlie, what the hell is this place?" He walked to where I stood, his movements unsteady, like a man walking on shifting deck plates. When he reached the edge of the dead zone, he stopped abruptly, his boots scuffing against the boundary between normal soil and the grey wasteland. This is where I found Danny's horse 30 years ago. His voice was barely above a whisper. Right here, at the edge of this damned circle. He gestured at the dead ground with a shaking hand. Wasn't quite this big then, maybe half the size. But the same grey soil, the same stench. Now that he mentioned it, I could smell it, a chemical odor that seemed to catch in the back of my throat and linger there. It was the same smell I'd detected at Charlie's homestead, but stronger here, more concentrated. Danny found this place first, Charlie continued, his voice barely audible above the morning breeze. He'd been tracking some missing sheep. Found 'em dead, just like your calf there. He looked at the small black form with something that might have been pity or recognition. Started asking questions in town, trying to find out what was killing the stock. He looked at me with haunted eyes, and I could see the weight of 30 years of guilt and grief pressing down on his shoulders. That's when the lights started coming for him. What do you mean, the lights started coming for him? I kept my voice steady, but Charlie's words were making my skin crawl. The clearing suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable, like we were standing in the crosshairs of something dangerous. He ran a shaking hand through his grey hair, the gesture automatic and unconscious. Danny got obsessed with this place. Started camping out here nights, trying to catch whoever was responsible. Charlie's eyes swept the horizon, constantly checking for threats. Said he'd seen vehicle tracks leading in from the old mining road, heavy machinery marks. But every time he tried to follow them back, they'd disappear. Charlie walked to the edge of the dead circle, careful not to step on the poisoned ground. His movements were those of a man approaching something dangerous, every step calculated and cautious. Then he started seeing the lights. Not natural ones, bright white beams that moved through the scrub at night, always heading toward this spot. He'd follow them, but they'd vanish before he could get close enough to see what was making them. Mining lights, I said, the pieces starting to fit together in my mind. Someone's been operating out here illegally. That's what Danny figured. Charlie's voice turned bitter, edged with old anger. But when he went to the police, they said there was no record of any mining permits for this area. Told him to stop chasing shadows and get back to his stock. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. 3 days later, his horse came home riderless. I stared at the geometric patterns carved into the earth, the oily shimmer of contaminated soil. The marks were too precise to be accidental, too purposeful to be natural weathering. Someone had been using this place regularly, systematically, for a very long time. How long has this been going on? The dead patch? Started showing up about 35 years ago, just a small spot at first. Charlie pointed at the center of the clearing, where the contamination seemed deepest. But it's been growing ever since, killing everything that tries to grow here. And every drought year, when the water table drops low enough. He trailed off, looking toward the horizon where I'd seen that strange glow the night before. Low enough for what? For them to dig deeper without hitting water. Charlie grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong despite his trembling hands. That's when the lights come back, when the operations start up again. Danny figured that much out before he disappeared. His eyes were wide with fear and something else, desperation. Tom, we need to get out of here. If they know you've found this place. They who? Who's doing this? But Charlie was already backing toward his ute, his panic returning full force. His movements were jerky, uncontrolled, like a man fighting the urge to run. I can't. I shouldn't have told you this much. Jesus, what was I thinking? He looked around the clearing like he expected someone to emerge from the scrub at any moment. I need to finish packing, get off the property before nightfall. Charlie, wait. I followed him to his vehicle, noting how his hands shook as he fumbled for the door handle. You can't just run. If there's an illegal operation poisoning our land, killing our stock, we need to report it. He laughed, but there was no humor in it, just the harsh sound of a man who'd reached the end of his rope. Reported to who? You think I haven't tried? You think in 30 years I never went to the authorities? He climbed into the driver's seat, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. Some things are bigger than us, Tom. Some fights aren't worth having. What aren't you telling me? For a moment, I thought he might answer. His mouth opened and closed like he was struggling with words that wouldn't come. But then his expression closed off, shutting down like a man slamming a door. He started the engine, the motor turning over rough and loud in the morning stillness. Keep your stock away from the eastern paddock, he said through the window, his voice barely audible above the engine noise. And don't come back here after dark. He drove off, leaving me standing in the poisoned clearing with my dead calf and more questions than answers. But one thing was clear, I wasn't running. This was my land, my livelihood, and whoever was responsible for this contamination was going to answer for it. I'd lost too much already to let faceless criminals drive me away from the only home I'd ever known. I spent the rest of the day making preparations, moving through the familiar routines with grim determination. Called my insurance company about the calf, though I didn't mention the circumstances of her death. That conversation could wait until I had more evidence. Checked my fences, moved my remaining cattle to the western paddocks as far from the dead ground as possible. Their nervousness was infectious, and I found myself jumping at shadows, constantly scanning the eastern horizon for signs of unusual activity. As evening approached, I loaded camping gear into my truck along with a thermos of coffee, a powerful torch, and my old hunting rifle. The .303 had belonged to my grandfather, and I'd used it to take countless pigs and wild dogs over the years. Tonight, I might be hunting something more dangerous. Charlie might be too frightened to stand his ground, but I'd be damned if I was going to let some illegal miners poison my property and kill my stock without a fight. This land had been in my family for 3 generations, and I wasn't about to be the McKinnon who gave it up to criminals and cowards. I drove back to the clearing as the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and red that reminded me uncomfortably of the chemical fires Charlie had warned about. I parked my truck in a grove of ironbarks about 200 meters from the contaminated area, positioning it where I had a clear view of the dead ground and the approaches from the north. From there, I could see anyone coming long before they spotted me. The stars came out clear and bright, the kind of night that made the isolation of the bush feel both peaceful and ominous. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, unmarred by city glow or atmospheric pollution. I sat in my camp chair with the rifle across my knees, watching and waiting, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon and the strange comfort it provided. Around 10 o'clock, I heard another vehicle approaching. Not the convoy I'd expected, but a single engine moving slowly through the scrub. Charlie's ute appeared at the edge of the clearing, moving slowly with its headlights off, navigating by starlight and memory. I watched through my binoculars as the old man climbed out, carrying what looked like his own camping gear. Despite his earlier panic, he'd decided to stay and face whatever was coming. There was something different about his movements now, less frantic than before. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who'd made peace with a difficult decision. He set up his swag about 50 meters from mine, close enough that we could support each other if trouble came, but far enough apart to cover more ground. His movements were efficient and practiced, the muscle memory of decades spent camping in rough country. "Tom," he called softly into the darkness, his voice barely carrying across the still air. "I know you're out there." "Here," I replied, not moving from my position but letting him know where I was. "Good." I could hear the relief in his voice. "We'll take turns keeping watch. You take first shift, wake me at 2. I settled in for a long night, scanning the scrubland for any sign of lights or movement. The hours crawled by, marked only by the distant sound of night birds and the rustle of small animals in the brush. My eyes grew heavy despite the coffee, and I had to fight the urge to let my guard down. At 2 o'clock, I walked over to Charlie's swag, my boots crunching on the dry grass. "Your turn," I whispered, touching his shoulder gently. He stirred and sat up immediately, looking alert despite having been asleep. His eyes were bright and focused in the starlight. "Anything?" "All quiet." I stretched, muscles cramped from sitting in one position too long. "But keep watching the eastern approach. I thought I saw some movement out that way around midnight." Charlie nodded and picked up his own torch, checking the beam before switching it off again. "Get some sleep. If they're coming, it'll be in the hours before dawn." I went back to my bedroll and tried to rest, but sleep came fitfully. Strange dreams plagued me, visions of lights moving through the scrub, of cattle standing motionless in perfect rows, of Danny Morrison walking into a grey wasteland that swallowed him whole. I kept waking with a start, checking my watch and scanning the horizon for signs of activity. I woke to the sound of my own voice calling out, though I couldn't remember what I'd been saying. Dawn light was filtering through the ironbarks, painting the landscape in shades of grey and gold. Charlie's watch had ended without him waking me, and I felt a stab of guilt at having slept so deeply. "Charlie?" No answer. I sat up, immediately alert, my hand reaching automatically for the rifle. I looked toward his camp and felt ice form in my stomach. His swag was empty, the blankets thrown back as if he'd gotten up quickly. His torch lay on the ground beside it, still switched on but nearly dead, the beam weak and yellow. "Charlie!" I called louder, grabbing my rifle and jogging toward his campsite. His boots were there, placed neatly beside the swag as if he'd stepped out of them to go to bed. But Charlie was gone, vanished as completely as his brother had 30 years ago. I spent the next hour searching the immediate area, calling Charlie's name until my throat was raw and my voice echoed off the low hills. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the air thick and oppressive with the promise of another scorching day. His rifle was still propped against the ironbark where he'd left it, and there were no signs of a struggle. The ground around his swag was too hard-packed to hold clear prints, but I found a few scuff marks leading toward the dead ground. Following the sparse trail, I moved carefully through the scrub, every sense alert for danger. Here and there, a broken twig or disturbed leaf litter suggested someone had passed this way recently. But the signs were faint, almost as if Charlie had been trying not to leave tracks. Or as if something had been covering him up behind him. My cattle were still grouped together near the fence line, as far from the eastern paddock as they could get. Their heads were raised and alert, ears swiveling constantly as they tracked sounds I couldn't hear. The sight of them huddled together like that made my skin crawl with primitive unease. At the edge of the poisoned ground, I found clearer signs. Charlie's sock prints were pressed into the softer earth at the boundary, but they didn't continue into the barren patch. Instead, they seemed to circle the perimeter, as if he'd been pacing or looking for something. The prints showed hesitation, backtracking, the movements of a man wrestling with a difficult decision. Then, about 20 meters to the north, I found where the tracks resumed, heading straight into the dead zone. I followed them for perhaps 50 meters before they simply stopped. One moment there were clear impressions in the grey soil, the next nothing but smooth, undisturbed earth. I crouched down, studying the ground with growing unease. The last print was deep, as if Charlie had been running or had stumbled. Beyond it, the earth was smooth as glass, lacking any trace of human passage. What the hell happened here? I muttered, turning in a slow circle. The dead calf still lay where I'd found it yesterday, bloated now in the heat, but nothing else moved in this sterile landscape. No insects, no birds, nothing but the oppressive silence of a place where life had been leached away. Even the flies that should have been swarming around the carcass were absent, as if they knew better than to venture into this cursed space. I expanded my search, working outward in wider circles, but found nothing more. Whatever had happened to Charlie, it had occurred in this cursed patch of ground, just like his brother 30 years ago. The similarity made my skin crawl with superstitious dread. Two men, both connected to this place, both vanishing without a trace in the same impossible way. By afternoon, I'd covered every meter of ground within a kilometer radius. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and my water bottle was nearly empty, but I'd found no trace of Charlie Morrison. I drove home to call the police, but the constable in town was skeptical, his voice carrying the weary patience of a man who'd dealt with bush mysteries before. Middle-aged men didn't just disappear, he said. Charlie had probably wandered off confused. Old blokes did that sometimes, especially when they'd been hitting the bottle or suffering from heat stress. They'd send someone out in a day or two if he didn't turn up, but these things usually resolved themselves. I tried to explain about the dead ground, the poisoned calf, the pattern that connected Charlie's disappearance to his brother's. But I could hear the doubt in the constable's voice, the urban skepticism that didn't understand how the bush could swallow a man without leaving so much as a footprint behind. That evening, I sat on my veranda with a beer, watching my cattle huddle together in the western paddock. They hadn't moved from that spot all day, and their nervousness was infectious. Every shadow seemed threatening, every sound suspicious. The drought-stressed landscape stretched out before me, empty and hostile under the setting sun. Charlie's words echoed in my mind. They always come back during drought years. What if the lights weren't some supernatural phenomenon, but something far more prosaic and dangerous? What if someone had been using the isolation of our properties for their own purposes, eliminating anyone who got too close to the truth? As darkness fell, I made my decision. I loaded my rifle and drove back to the dead ground, determination overriding fear. If the lights appeared again tonight, I'd be ready for them. Charlie might be gone, but I wasn't going to let his disappearance remain another unsolved mystery like his brother's. I parked behind the same stand of ironbarks and settled in to wait. This time, I positioned myself where I could see both the barren patch and the access tracks leading in from the north. If someone was using this area for clandestine purposes, they'd have to come from somewhere, and I'd be watching when they did. Around 11 o'clock, I heard the distant rumble of engines. Not the single vehicle I'd expected, but multiple machines moving in convoy. The sound was wrong, too heavy, too powerful for ordinary farm equipment. I crouched lower, peering through the scrub as headlights appeared on the northern horizon. 3 vehicles, moving without regard for the rough terrain, heading straight for the dead ground. As they drew closer, I could see they weren't ordinary cars or utes. These were heavy trucks with specialized equipment mounted on their backs, industrial vehicles that had no business being in remote grazing country. The lead vehicle was a water tanker, its massive bulk riding high on reinforced suspension. Behind it came what looked like a pump truck, bristling with hoses and mechanical equipment. A smaller utility vehicle brought up the rear, its bed loaded with containers and machinery I couldn't identify from this distance. They moved with the confidence of people who'd made this journey many times before. The convoy pulled up at the edge of the barren patch and men began climbing out. Even in the darkness, I could see they wore protective clothing, coveralls and masks that caught the moonlight with an artificial sheen. They moved with practiced efficiency, unloading equipment and setting up what appeared to be some kind of pumping operation. Their movements were quick and coordinated, following a routine they'd clearly rehearsed many times. Within minutes, they had hoses running from the tanker truck to several points around the dead zone. The pump truck roared to life, its diesel engine echoing across the empty landscape. I watched in growing horror as they began spraying something across the poisoned ground. The liquid caught what little light there was, creating an eerie phosphorescent glow that would be visible from kilometers away. These were the lights Charlie and his brother had seen. Not supernatural phenomena, but illegal dumping on a massive scale. The chemicals they were spraying were what had killed the vegetation, poisoned the wildlife, and turned this section of scrubland into a sterile wasteland. They'd been using our remote location as their private disposal site, probably for years, maybe decades. The operation continued for over an hour. I counted 6 men working with military precision, clearly following a well-rehearsed routine. They moved equipment with the efficiency of professionals, checking connections, monitoring pressure gauges, communicating with hand signals when the engine noise made voices impossible. When they finished, the lead truck's engine coughed and died. In the sudden quiet, I heard voices carrying across the still air, fragments of conversation that made my blood run cold. Finish by dawn if we keep this pace. Old man saw too much. Boss says clean up everything before we move to the next site. My blood turned to ice. They were talking about Charlie. The old man had discovered their operation, just like his brother had 30 years ago, and they'd silenced him to protect their illegal dumping scheme. Charlie wasn't missing, he was being held prisoner, or worse. I started to back away, intending to reach my ute and drive for help, but my boot caught a fallen branch. The sharp crack echoed across the clearing like a gunshot, impossibly loud in the still air. The voices stopped abruptly, and flashlight beams began sweeping the tree line, moving systematically toward my position. Someone's out there, a voice called, harsh and professional. Check the perimeter. I abandoned stealth and ran, crashing through the scrub toward my vehicle. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit, boots pounding on hard ground and equipment being hastily abandoned. My ute seemed impossibly far away, and the men chasing me knew this terrain as well as I did. They'd been operating here for years, long enough to memorize every track and hiding place. I reached the ironbarks just as flashlight beams converged on my position. The ute's engine turned over on the second try, and I gunned it toward the main track, not caring about the noise or the dust cloud I was raising. In my rearview mirror, I could see vehicle lights following, but my old Toyota had the advantage of local knowledge. I knew every pothole and washout between here and the homestead. The chase continued for 20 minutes before I lost them in the maze of stock routes near my boundary fence. But I'd seen enough to understand the scope of what we were dealing with. This wasn't some small-time operation, it was an organized criminal enterprise that had been using our isolation to dispose of industrial waste, turning productive grazing land into dead zones while eliminating anyone who threatened to expose them. And somewhere out there, Charlie was still alive. The men had talked about cleaning up, which suggested they hadn't killed him yet. There might still be time to save him, if I could reach help before they decided he was too much of a liability to keep breathing. I drove straight to the homestead and called the police from the landline, my hands shaking as I dialed the number. The desk sergeant listened skeptically to my story about illegal dumping and a missing neighbor until I mentioned the organized nature of the operation and the industrial trucks. That got his attention. He promised to dispatch units from the regional center, but warned it would take at least 2 hours for them to reach my property. 2 hours Charlie might not have. I loaded my rifle and filled a thermos with coffee, then drove back toward the dead zone, taking a different route this time. If the miners were cleaning up their operation, they'd be vulnerable, distracted by the need to erase evidence before dawn. But they'd also be desperate, which made them unpredictable and dangerous. I parked the ute a kilometer away and approached on foot, using the dry creek bed for cover. The activity at their camp had intensified, more trucks had arrived, and men were working frantically to dismantle equipment and load chemical drums onto flatbed trailers. Floodlights turned the clearing into a harsh theater of shadows. And industrial noise, the generators roaring like mechanical dragons. From my position behind a fallen log, I counted 8 men, all armed with sidearms and moving with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. This wasn't their first sight, and it wouldn't be their last unless someone stopped them. They'd been exploiting the isolation of drought-stricken stations for years, knowing that desperate farmers would be too focused on survival to investigate strange activities on neighboring properties. Then I saw him. Charlie sat tied to a chair beside one of the trucks, his head slumped forward but moving slightly with each labored breath. Relief flooded through me. The old man was alive, though he looked rough. Even from a distance, I could see the bruises on his face and the way his clothes hung torn and dirty on his diminished frame. 2 guards flanked him, automatic weapons slung casually across their chests. These weren't local criminals, they had the bearing and equipment of professionals, possibly ex-military. The kind of men who viewed witnesses as problems to be eliminated rather than complications to be managed. I needed to create a distraction, something that would draw most of them away from Charlie while giving me a chance to free him. The fuel depot caught my eye, dozens of drums stacked beside the trucks, some leaking chemicals that pooled in the red dirt and gave off visible vapors in the harsh light. A few rifle shots into those containers would create enough chaos to cover a rescue attempt. I worked my way around the perimeter until I had a clear sight line to the fuel storage area. The first shot punched through a chemical drum with a metallic clang, releasing a stream of toxic liquid that immediately began smoking where it hit the ground. The second shot sparked off metal, and suddenly the night erupted in flames as vapors ignited with a whoosh that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the air. Men shouted and ran for fire extinguishers while others grabbed weapons and began searching for the shooter. In the confusion, Charlie's guards moved away from their prisoner, trying to establish a defensive perimeter around the burning depot. I sprinted toward the trucks, keeping low and using the smoke as cover. The acrid fumes burned my eyes and throat, but adrenaline kept me moving. Charlie looked up as I approached, his eyes widening with recognition and hope. His face was worse than I'd thought, split lips, blackened eyes, the kind of systematic beating meant to break a man's spirit. "Can you walk?" I whispered, pulling out my knife to cut through his restraints. The ropes were thick and expertly tied, but the blade was sharp. He nodded weakly, working his hands to restore circulation as the bonds fell away. "Been waiting for someone to show up. Thought they'd killed you too." We made it halfway to the tree line before someone spotted us. Shouts erupted behind us, followed immediately by the sharp crack of rifle fire. Bullets whined past, our heads like angry wasps as we stumbled toward cover, Charlie's legs barely supporting his weight after hours tied to that chair. There, by the ironbarks, more gunfire, closer now. A bullet splintered bark inches from my face as we dove behind a massive tree trunk, the impact sending fragments of wood flying. Charlie was breathing hard, his face grey with exhaustion and pain. "Can't run much further," he gasped, clutching his ribs where they'd obviously worked him over. "Leave me and get help." "Not happening." I checked my rifle's magazine, 4 rounds left, not nearly enough for a sustained firefight against professional operators. But I didn't need to win, just buy enough time for the police to arrive. Footsteps crashed through the undergrowth on both sides of our position. They were trying to flank us, using classic military tactics to pin us down while others moved to cut off our escape routes. These men had done this before, in places where witnesses disappeared permanently and questions went unasked. "Davidson," the voice came from directly ahead, confident and commanding. "We know you're behind that tree. Walk out with your hands visible and we'll make this quick. Keep playing soldier and my boys will take their time with both of you." I recognized the voice from the radio chatter I'd overheard earlier, the team leader, the man who'd been giving orders about cleaning up evidence and eliminating problems. In his world, Charlie and I were just loose ends to be tied off before the operation relocated to fresh hunting grounds. "Your choice, mate, but we've got you surrounded and all the time in the world." That was a lie. They were racing against dawn and the possibility of police arrival, which meant they'd have to move soon regardless of whether we surrendered. The smart play was to keep him talking while working toward better cover. "How long have you been poisoning our land?" I called back, scanning the surrounding scrub for movement. A harsh laugh echoed through the darkness. "Long enough to know that nobody cares what happens out here. You station owners are so desperate to survive that you'll ignore anything that doesn't directly affect your bottom line." The voice was getting closer, more confident. "Hell, we've been dumping chemicals from 3 states across this region for 5 years, and you're the first one to even notice. What happened to Charlie's brother? Same thing that's about to happen to you. Some people just can't leave well enough alone." Movement in the shadows to our left, 2 men working their way closer under cover of the conversation. I put a bullet through the chest of the first one, the .303 bucking against my shoulder with familiar authority. He spun backward into a tree with a wet thud, his automatic weapon clattering to the ground. His partner dove for cover, but not before I saw the military-style body armor and night vision equipment. These weren't just criminals, they were part of a sophisticated organization. With serious funding and professional training. The kind of operation that could make people disappear without leaving traces, covering their tracks with bribes and intimidation while exploiting the isolation of rural communities. "Last chance, Davidson, throw out your weapon and step into the light." Instead, I grabbed Charlie's arm and pulled him deeper into the scrub, moving parallel to the creek bed where the undergrowth provided better concealment. Behind us, angry voices coordinated a search pattern while the chemical fire continued to illuminate the clearing in hellish orange light. We made it another 100 meters before they cornered us against a rock outcrop, flashlight beams converging from 3 directions like the fingers of some mechanical god. Charlie collapsed against the stone, breathing in ragged gasps that spoke of internal injuries from his captivity. Nowhere left to run, the team leader called, his voice smug with anticipated victory. Come out now and I'll make sure the old man dies quick. I was down to my last 2 bullets, and Charlie could barely stand. But in the distance, I could hear the faint sound of helicopter rotors growing louder by the minute. The police were coming, and these men knew it. Their confident voices carried an edge of desperation now, the knowledge that their window for cleanup was rapidly closing. The standoff stretched through the longest minutes of my life, professional killers hunting us through the scrub while emergency sirens wailed across the paddocks. Dawn was breaking over the horizon, painting the toxic smoke in shades of red and gold, when the helicopter finally appeared with a searchlight that turned night into day. 3 months later, I stood at the fence line watching my cattle graze in the eastern paddock for the first time in years. The chemical fires had burned for 2 days before the hazmat teams could contain them, but the autumn rains had finally washed the last of the poison from the soil. Green shoots pushed through the scarred earth where nothing had grown since Charlie's brother first stumbled onto their dumping ground 30 years ago. The mining company, if you could call it that, had been a front for industrial waste disposal, taking contaminated materials from manufacturing plants across 3 states and burying them in remote locations where nobody would look. The kind of operation that required silence from locals, bought with cash payments to struggling landowners or eliminated through more permanent means when money wasn't enough. Charlie sat in the passenger seat of my ute, still moving carefully but insisting he was strong enough for the drive out from town. The doctors said he'd been systematically poisoned over months, small doses of heavy metals mixed into supplies they'd been giving him as part of their arrangement. When he'd finally threatened to talk, they'd simply accelerated the process. Hard to believe it's over, he said, watching a mob of my younger cattle explore ground they'd instinctively avoided for their entire lives. 30 years of thinking my brother had been taken by something supernatural, when it was just greed wearing a human face. The federal investigation had uncovered burial sites across 4 properties, including 2 more missing persons cases that had gone cold decades ago. Local authorities had written them off as people who'd simply walked away from failed farms, but the truth was uglier and more systematic. The operation had been selecting isolated properties near struggling stations, using financial pressure and intimidation to create zones where they could work undisturbed. Your brother figured it out the same way I did, I said, watching the cattle move with the unhurried confidence of animals who finally felt safe in their environment. Saw the dead cattle and decided to investigate instead of looking the other way. Charlie nodded, his weathered hands trembling slightly, a permanent reminder of what the chemicals had done to his nervous system. They offered me $5,000 a month just to keep my mouth shut and report any unusual activity from neighboring properties. Seemed like a fortune when you're watching your stock die from drought and your bank account bleeding red. I understood the temptation better than I wanted to admit. The mining company had approached me twice over the years, always during the worst financial periods, offering cash payments for easement rights or storage facilities. I'd turned them down both times, but only because something felt wrong about men in expensive suits showing up during droughts with solutions that seemed too good to be true. The lights you saw, I said, remembering that first morning when his cattle had stood facing east like sentinels. Were they always part of their operation? Industrial spotlights for night work. Charlie's voice was stronger now, though still carrying the weight of decades of guilt and grief. They'd bring in crews after midnight, dig new pits or move equipment, then cover everything before dawn. Made it look supernatural to anyone watching from a distance, especially during drought years when they ramped up operations. The psychological manipulation had been as sophisticated as their technical setup. They'd encouraged local folklore about unexplained phenomena, knowing that people were more likely to avoid areas they thought were haunted than investigate obvious environmental damage. Charlie's guilt over his brother's disappearance had made him an ideal victim, desperate enough to accept their money, isolated enough to keep their secrets, and too damaged by grief to ask hard questions about their activities. A police helicopter passed overhead, part of the ongoing cleanup operation that would continue for another 6 months. The contaminated soil had to be excavated and properly disposed of, the groundwater tested and treated, the entire area monitored for years to ensure nothing toxic remained. The cost would run into millions, funded by federal environmental agencies and the seized assets of the disposal company's offshore accounts. What will you do now? Charlie asked as we watched the helicopter disappear toward town, its rotors beating a steady rhythm against the clear sky. I'd been asking myself the same question for weeks now. The compensation payments from the federal investigation would cover my immediate debts and provide enough capital to restock properly, but the real answer was more complicated. The experience had changed something fundamental about how I viewed my responsibilities as a landowner. Rebuild, I said, feeling the truth of it settle into my bones. But different this time. I'm thinking of converting some of the marginal paddocks to native vegetation, maybe partnering with the university on soil restoration projects. There's grant money available for station owners who want to balance production with environmental protection. It wasn't just about the money, though that certainly helped. The investigation had revealed how many warning signs I'd missed over the years, dead zones in the landscape that I'd attributed to natural causes, behavioral changes in wildlife that I'd dismissed as seasonal patterns, subtle contamination that had been slowly poisoning the ecosystem while I focused on short-term survival. Charlie smiled, the first genuine expression of hope I'd seen from him since his rescue. The expression transformed his weathered features, making him look younger despite everything he'd endured. Your grandfather would approve. He always said the land would take care of you if you took care of it first. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant across the paddocks, painting the recovering grassland in shades of gold and green. My cattle moved through it with the unhurried confidence of animals who no longer sensed invisible threats. Even the wildlife was returning, kangaroos grazing openly instead of skulking at the tree line, birds nesting in areas they'd abandoned for years. A text message buzzed on my phone from Detective Williams, updating me on the trial preparations. The mining company executives were fighting extradition from overseas, but the evidence was overwhelming: financial records, chemical analysis, witness testimony from employees who'd been promised immunity. The federal prosecutor expected guilty pleas on most charges, with sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. Justice, Charlie said, reading over my shoulder. A start, I corrected, watching my cattle spread across grass that was finally growing green and strong again. Real justice would be bringing back everyone who disappeared, undoing 30 years of environmental damage, giving people their lives back. But it was something. The kind of systematic exploitation that had thrived on isolation and silence was harder to maintain once communities started talking to each other instead of suffering alone. The investigation had connected station owners across the region, sharing information about suspicious activities and coordinating responses to unusual offers from outside companies. As we drove back toward the homestead, I noticed Charlie studying the landscape with new attention, pointing out subtle changes that suggested recovery. The old man's knowledge of local conditions was encyclopedic, accumulated over 6 decades of working the same stretch of country, and his ability to read environmental signs had been dulled but not destroyed by his ordeal. The creek's running clearer, he observed as we crossed the bridge, the water reflecting the late afternoon sky like polished metal. Haven't seen it that clean since I was a boy. I parked outside the house and helped him down from the passenger seat, noting how much stronger he looked compared to the broken figure they'd pulled from that mining camp. The doctors said full recovery would take years, if it happened at all, but Charlie's determination to testify and see justice done had given him a purpose that medication couldn't provide. The kitchen table was covered with paperwork, insurance claims, environmental assessments, correspondence with government agencies and legal teams. The administrative aftermath of the investigation would continue for years, but the immediate crisis was over. My cattle were healthy, the land was healing, and the people responsible were facing consequences for their actions. Outside, the first stars were becoming visible in a sky unmarked by suspicious lights or chemical fires. The eastern pad.